Imagine walking into a room full of people who all know a secret about you, a secret so fundamental that it shapes every conversation, every opportunity, every relationship you'll ever have. They smile politely, shake your hand, offer you a seat at their table, but behind their eyes lies a quiet understanding. You are exactly where they need you to be. Weak, dependent, controllable. Now, imagine discovering that this isn't paranoia, it's design. Every morning, you wake up believing. You're making choices. You choose your breakfast, your route to work, your entertainment, even your dreams for the future. But what if I told you that these choices were crafted for you long before you were born? That an invisible architecture surrounds your mind, gently guiding every decision toward the same inevitable conclusion, your own diminishment? Consider this unsettling truth. The very systems that promise to elevate you, education, media, social networks, consumer culture, all share one peculiar characteristic. They consistently produce the same type of person: anxious, distracted, financially dependent, emotionally reactive, and desperately seeking external validation. Is this an accident? Or is this the point? You've been taught that weakness is a disease to be cured. But what if weakness is actually a product to be manufactured? What if your struggles with confidence, your endless scrolling through social media, your perpetual sense that you're not enough? What if these aren't personal failings, but carefully engineered features of a system that profits from your inadequacy? Think about the last time you felt truly powerful. Not the fleeting high of a purchase or a compliment, but genuinely untouchable, immune to manipulation, unshakable in your convictions, completely sovereign over your own mind. How long did it last? Hours? Minutes? And what subtle forces pulled you back into doubt, back into need, back into the comfortable prison of seeking approval from others? Here's where the paradox becomes disturbing. The very institutions that claim to want your success have business models that depend on your failure. Social media platforms profit from your insecurity. The education system benefits from your compliance. The consumer economy requires your perpetual dissatisfaction. Political systems thrive on your fear and division. Mental health industries expand through your ongoing struggles. But the most chilling realization isn't that these systems exist, how seamlessly they've convinced you that your weakness is your fault. You blame yourself for lacking willpower. When algorithms are designed by teams of neuroscientists to hijack your attention, you criticize your inability to focus when your environment has been systematically engineered to fragment your consciousness. You feel ashamed of your financial struggles when economic policies have been structured to concentrate wealth upward while convincing you that poverty is a personal moral failing. The brilliant cruelty of this system is that it doesn't need to chain you down. It simply needs to convince you to chain yourself. It whispers that you're not smart enough, attractive enough, successful enough, and then sells you endless products and programs promising to fix these manufactured inadequacies. It creates the wound and then profits from selling you the bandage, ensuring the wound never fully heals. But here's what they don't want you to understand. Your weakness isn't a bug in the system. It's the feature the entire system was built around. Every great philosopher who dared to examine power understood this fundamental principle. Those who control the narrative control reality. Those who control your attention control your thoughts. Those who control your thoughts control your actions. Those who control your actions control your life. And those who control your life don't need to rule you by force. They simply need to make you rule yourself according to their design. The question that haunts every thinking person eventually surfaces. If this is true, if weakness is manufactured, and dependency is designed, then what becomes possible when you recognize the game being played? What happens when you stop participating in your own diminishment? What happens when you become so psychologically sovereign, so unshakable in your core, that the entire apparatus of control becomes powerless against you? The answer to that question threatens everything they've built. Because when you become truly untouchable, not through arrogance or aggression, but through complete psychological independence, you don't just free yourself. You become a living example of what's possible, and that example has the power to awaken others. This is why they need you weak. And this is why understanding how to become untouchable isn't just personal development. It's an act of rebellion that strikes at the very heart of how power operates in the modern world. To understand how deeply this manufactured weakness penetrates your psyche, you must first grasp what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance that shapes how entire populations think, feel, and behave. But Jung discovered something far more sinister than he initially revealed. This collective unconscious isn't just naturally occurring. It can be deliberately programmed. The architects of modern society understood something that most people never realize. Human beings are not rational actors making independent choices. We are social creatures whose deepest psychological needs belonging, significance, security can be weaponized against us. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this when he wrote about the herd mentality. But even he couldn't have imagined how sophisticated the herding mechanisms would become. Consider the psychological conditioning that begins in childhood. You're taught to sit still, follow instructions, seek approval from authority figures, and measure your worth through external validation, grades, prizes, recognition. The education system doesn't just fill your mind with information. It programs your nervous system to crave validation and fear rejection. By the time you reach adulthood, the need for approval has become so deeply embedded that you barely notice how it controls your every decision. Arthur Schopenhauer identified this as the fundamental source of human suffering, the relentless drive of what he called the will, the blind, unconscious force that pushes you to constantly want, need, and strive. But modern society has weaponized this will, channeling it not toward authentic self-realization, but toward consumption, competition, and conformity. The genius of contemporary control lies in its invisibility. Unlike the brutal totalitarian regimes of the past that relied on force, modern power operates through what Aldous Huxley prophetically described in Brave New World: pleasure, distraction, and the illusion of choice. You're not forced to be weak. You're seduced into weakness. You're not commanded to obey. You're entertained into compliance. Every algorithm on your phone is designed to trigger what psychologists call intermittent variable reinforcement, the same psychological mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Every social media notification hijacks your dopamine pathways, creating a chemical dependency on external validation. Every advertisement is crafted using insights from behavioral psychology to make you feel inadequate without their product. The deepest level of this programming targets something even more fundamental: your relationship with your own mind. Jean-Paul Sartre understood that human consciousness is characterized by radical freedom, the terrifying responsibility of creating meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. This freedom is so overwhelming that most people desperately seek ways to escape it. The system exploits this existential anxiety by offering you prepackaged identities, ready-made purposes, and prescribed paths to happiness. Instead of confronting the weight of your own freedom, you're encouraged to lose yourself in work, entertainment, relationships, political causes, anything that provides the illusion of meaning without requiring you to take full responsibility for creating that meaning yourself. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered that the difference between those who psychologically survived and those who didn't wasn't physical strength or intelligence. It was the ability to maintain inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. Those who remained unbroken understood what the system desperately tries to obscure: Your power doesn't come from controlling your environment. It comes from controlling your response to your environment. This is precisely what threatens the architects of manufactured weakness. A person who has developed genuine psychological sovereignty, who generates their own sense of worth, creates their own meaning, and remains unmoved by the emotional manipulations of others, cannot be controlled through the traditional mechanisms of fear, desire, or social pressure. The psychological roots of this manufactured weakness run even deeper than individual conditioning. Jung warned of what he called psychic inflation, the tendency of societies to become possessed by collective ideologies that override individual thinking. When entire populations become psychologically dependent on external authorities for their sense of reality, truth becomes whatever those authorities declare it to be. But here's what the philosophers understood that modern psychology has forgotten. This dependency isn't natural or inevitable. Throughout history, certain individuals have discovered how to immunize themselves against collective psychological contagion. They developed what Nietzsche called intellectual integrity, the courage to think their own thoughts, feel their own feelings, and live according to their own values, regardless of social pressure. These individuals became untouchable, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they understood something fundamental about the nature of power. It only works when you give it permission to work. The moment you stop seeking external validation, stop fearing social rejection, stop needing others to confirm your worth, that's the moment you become psychologically immune to manipulation. The system's greatest fear isn't revolution or rebellion, it's irrelevance. When enough people become genuinely self-possessed, the entire apparatus of control simply becomes powerless. This is why every totalitarian regime throughout history has targeted the same type of person, the independent thinker who refuses to be psychologically colonized. The question that emerges from this understanding cuts to the core of human existence. If your weakness has been manufactured, if your dependencies have been designed, if your very sense of self has been shaped by forces that profit from your inadequacy, then who are you really beneath all of that programming? The answer to that question reveals consequences so profound they reshape everything you thought you knew about reality itself. Because when you begin to see how manufactured weakness operates, you realize it doesn't just affect your personal choices, it fundamentally alters the fabric of human civilization. Consider what happens to a society when the majority of its population becomes psychologically dependent on external validation. Democracy, which depends on citizens capable of independent thought, gradually transforms into what psychologists call the tyranny of the crowd. People don't vote based on careful consideration of issues. They vote based on which narrative makes them feel safer, more righteous, or more accepted by their chosen tribe. The consequences cascade through every institution. In relationships, people stop seeking genuine connection and instead perform elaborate dances of validation seeking. Marriage becomes a transaction where partners trade emotional services, approval, security, status, rather than two sovereign individuals choosing to share their lives. The divorce rate skyrockets not because people are selfish, but because they enter relationships as half people seeking completion from another half person, creating inevitable disappointment when their partner fails to fill the void that only self-possession can fill. In the workplace, manufactured weakness creates what researchers call learned helplessness on a massive scale. Employees become so accustomed to being told what to think, when to work, and how to behave that they lose the capacity for genuine initiative. Innovation dies because creativity requires the courage to risk failure, and psychologically dependent people cannot tolerate the possibility of rejection or criticism. But the most insidious consequence operates at the neurological level. When your brain becomes accustomed to external stimulation, constant notifications, entertainment, social media, dopamine hits, it literally rewires itself to become incapable of generating internal satisfaction. Neuroscientists have discovered that people who spend significant time on social media develop brain patterns identical to those found in gambling addicts and substance abusers. This neurological dependency creates what philosophers call the paradox of choice. You have more options than any generation in human history, yet you feel increasingly paralyzed by indecision. Why? Because your neural pathways have been trained to seek external guidance for every choice. Your brain has literally forgotten how to generate preferences from within. The economic consequences are staggering. When entire populations become psychologically dependent on consumption for emotional regulation, they create what economists call artificial scarcity. People work longer hours to afford lifestyles they don't actually want, buying products they don't need, to impress people they don't like, all while their actual needs, autonomy, meaning, genuine connection, remain unfulfilled. Credit card debt, which didn't exist in meaningful numbers until the 1970s, now represents the emotional state of entire nations, living beyond their means, not just financially, but psychologically. People borrow against their future selves to maintain a present identity that was marketed to them by forces that profit from their perpetual dissatisfaction. The cultural consequences penetrate even deeper. When people become uncomfortable with solitude, they lose access to what psychologists call the observing self, the part of consciousness that can step back and examine its own thoughts and feelings. Without this capacity for self-reflection, individuals become completely identified with their emotions, reactions, and impulses. They lose the ability to choose their responses to life's challenges. This creates what researchers call emotional contagion on a societal scale. When most people lack the psychological boundaries that come from genuine self-possession, emotions spread through populations like viruses. Panic, outrage, despair, and hysteria become collective experiences that can be triggered and directed by whoever controls the information flow. The spiritual consequences may be the most devastating of all. When your sense of worth depends on external validation, you lose contact with what every wisdom tradition has identified as the source of genuine power, the unchanging awareness that exists beneath all thoughts, emotions, and circumstances. This awareness, what Jung called the self, with a capital S, is your true nature, the part of you that remains unaffected by success or failure, praise or criticism, gain or loss. But manufactured weakness systematically disconnects you from this deeper self by keeping you focused on the ego's endless needs and fears. You become so identified with your persona, the mask you wear to gain approval, that you forget there's anyone underneath the mask. This creates what existentialists call existential vacuum, a life that appears successful on the surface, but feels hollow at its core. The most chilling consequence is how this manufactured weakness becomes self-perpetuating across generations. Parents who never developed psychological sovereignty raise children who become even more dependent on external validation. Each generation becomes more anxious, more distracted, more unable to tolerate discomfort, more desperate for approval. Then the last dot yet, within this seemingly hopeless cycle lies a hidden opportunity. Because once you understand how manufactured weakness operates, once you see how it shapes your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, you gain something more powerful than any external advantage. You gain the ability to choose a different path. Recognition of these consequences isn't meant to discourage you, it's meant to show you the stakes. Every moment you spend unconsciously seeking validation, every decision you make based on fear of rejection, every time you allow your emotions to be manipulated by forces that profit from your psychological dependency, you're not just limiting your own potential. You're participating in the systematic weakening of human consciousness itself. But what happens when you refuse to participate? What happens when you become psychologically sovereign, emotionally self-sufficient, and spiritually grounded. What happens when you become truly untouchable? The rebellion begins with a single, radical act. You stop asking permission to exist as you are. This sounds simple, but it represents a complete inversion of everything you've been taught about how to navigate the world. From childhood, you've been conditioned to seek approval, avoid conflict, and modify your behavior based on others' reactions. The rebellion against manufactured weakness starts when you recognize that this entire framework is a trap designed to keep you psychologically enslaved. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal nearly 2,000 years ago, captured the essence of this rebellion. How much trouble he avoids, who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself. The Roman emperor understood that true power comes not from controlling others, but from becoming completely autonomous in your own responses to life. The first stage of rebellion is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you've been programmed to be. This requires developing what philosophers call negative capability, the ability to remain comfortable with uncertainty, doubt, and the unknown without frantically seeking external reassurance. Consider how revolutionary this becomes in practice. When someone criticizes you, instead of immediately defending yourself or seeking validation from others, you pause and ask, is this criticism useful information, or is it simply a reflection of their own psychological state? You stop taking other people's opinions as facts about reality and start treating them as data points that may or may not be relevant to your path. The rebellion deepens when you begin to reclaim your attention. Every moment your mind is scattered across social media, entertainment, or news cycles is a moment stolen from your own psychological development. The ancient Stoics understood that attention is the most precious resource you possess, more valuable than time, money, or energy, because it's the mechanism through which you create your experience of reality. This means becoming ruthlessly selective about what you allow into your consciousness. Instead of passively consuming whatever content algorithms serve you, you actively choose what deserves your mental energy. You start treating your mind like a sacred space that requires protection from psychological pollution. Historical examples of this rebellion illuminate what becomes possible. Henry David Thoreau didn't just write about simple living, he demonstrated how psychological independence could be achieved by refusing to participate in systems that required his spiritual compromise. He spent a night in jail rather than pay taxes supporting a war he considered unjust, understanding that true freedom sometimes requires accepting external consequences to maintain internal integrity. Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, truth force, represents perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of how individual psychological sovereignty can transform entire societies. He realized that when you become unmovable in your core principles, when you stop seeking approval from those who profit from your weakness, you become a force that can reshape reality itself. But the rebellion isn't just about resistance, it's about reconstruction. As you withdraw your psychological energy from the systems that depend on your weakness, you must simultaneously build new sources of strength, meaning, and purpose that come from within rather than from external validation. This requires developing what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. Instead of constantly trying to manipulate circumstances to make yourself feel better, you learn to find strength in whatever reality presents. You stop needing life to be different than it is in order to feel powerful, because your power comes from your response to life, rather than from life's compliance with your preferences. The rebellion becomes complete when you realize that your psychological independence doesn't isolate you from others. It actually enables deeper, more authentic connections. When you stop seeking validation, you can finally offer genuine presence. When you stop fearing rejection, you can speak your truth without agenda. When you stop needing others to be different than they are, You can love them as they actually are rather than as projections of your own needs. This creates what psychologists call earned security, the deep confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life presents, because your sense of self doesn't depend on external circumstances. You develop what the Stoics called the citadel of the self, an inner fortress that remains untouchable regardless of what happens in the world around you. The most radical aspect of this rebellion is that it doesn't require you to change the world, it requires you to change your relationship to the world. You stop trying to control outcomes and start focusing on controlling your inputs, your thoughts, your attention, your energy, your responses. This shift from external manipulation to internal mastery is what transforms you from a victim of circumstances into a creator of your own experience. But here's what makes this rebellion truly dangerous to the systems that depend on your weakness. It's contagious. When people encounter someone who has achieved genuine psychological sovereignty, they immediately recognize something they've been missing in their own lives. Your freedom becomes a mirror that reflects their imprisonment, and that reflection has the power to awaken them to possibilities they didn't know existed. The rebellion spreads not through preaching or convincing, but through example. When you become unshakable in your core, unmoved by the emotional manipulations that control others, and genuinely content with your own company, you become living proof that another way is possible. This is why the final stage of rebellion isn't just about personal transformation. It's about recognizing the ultimate truth that makes you completely untouchable. The ultimate truth that renders you untouchable is this: you have never been weak. Weakness is not something you possess, it's something you perform. This realization shatters everything you thought you knew about personal development, self-improvement, and human nature itself. All those years of trying to fix yourself, strengthen yourself, improve yourself, you are chasing shadows. You are trying to add something to your being that was never missing in the first place. The deepest secret that the architects have manufactured, weakness guard most carefully, is that your essential nature is already complete, already powerful, already untouchable. The system's entire foundation depends on convincing you that you lack something fundamental, that you need external additions to become whole. But this is the grandest lie ever told. Consider the moments in your life when you felt most powerful, most alive, most yourself. What were you doing? You weren't performing strength. You were simply being authentic. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were expressing your genuine nature. You weren't seeking validation. You were creating value from your unique perspective. In those moments, you glimpsed your true nature beneath all the conditioning. The ancient Greek concept of aletheia, often translated as truth, literally means uncovering or unveiling. Truth isn't something you acquire. It's something you uncover by removing what obscures it. Your power isn't something you build. It's something you reveal by stripping away the false beliefs that hide it. This is why every spiritual tradition ultimately points to the same recognition. You are not the small, fragmented, needy ego that seeks approval and fears rejection. That ego is a construct, a collection of thoughts and beliefs that you've mistaken for your identity. Your true nature, what the mystics call your original face, is the unchanging awareness that observes all thoughts, emotions, and experiences, without being touched by them. When this truth penetrates not just your mind, but your bones, everything changes. You realize that all the manipulation, all the systems designed to keep you weak, all the external validation you've been seeking, none of it can touch what you actually are. How can you manipulate awareness itself? How can you diminish something that exists prior to all thoughts of adequacy or inadequacy? This recognition creates what the Zen masters call great doubt. Not doubt about external facts, but doubt about everything you believed about yourself. You begin to question, if I am not the thoughts that tell me I'm not good enough, then who am I? If I am not the emotions that make me feel powerless, then what am I? If I am not the story I tell about my past, my limitations, my needs, then what remains? What remains is pure being, unconditioned awareness, the part of you that has been present through every experience of your life, but has never been diminished by any of them. This is your unassailable core, your inner citadel that cannot be breached by any external force. The practical implications of this realization are staggering. When you truly understand that your essential nature is untouchable, you stop defending a self that doesn't exist. You stop trying to prove your worth because you recognize that worth is not something you possess, it's something you are. You stop seeking validation because you realize that no external confirmation can add anything to what you already are. This doesn't make you arrogant or disconnected from others. Paradoxically, it makes you more loving, more present, more genuinely helpful. When you're not constantly defending a fragile ego, you can offer others the gift of your authentic presence. When you're not seeking approval, you can give genuine appreciation. When you're not afraid of rejection, you can love without agenda. Ultimate rebellion against manufactured. Weakness is to embody this truth so completely that you become immune to the psychological viruses that infect most people. Criticism bounces off you not because you're defensive, but because you recognize it as information about the critic rather than truth about you. Praise doesn't inflate you because you know it adds nothing to what you already are. Success doesn't define you because you understand it as a temporary external circumstance. Failure doesn't diminish you because you know it cannot touch your essential nature. You become like a mountain that remains unmoved whether the weather brings sunshine or storms. The mountain doesn't resist the storm or cling to the sunshine. It simply remains itself through all conditions. This is the state of being untouchable, not because you're hard or defended, but because you've realized there's nothing that needs defending. When you embody this truth, you become a force of nature, not because you dominate others, but because you demonstrate what it looks like to be completely free from the need to dominate or be dominated. Your very presence reminds others of their own forgotten wholeness. Your peace exposes their inner turmoil as unnecessary. Your contentment reveals their seeking as a habit rather than a necessity. This is why truly untouchable people throughout history have been both revered and feared. They represent something that threatens the entire structure of manufactured weakness. The possibility that suffering is optional, that seeking approval is a choice, that feeling powerless is a learned behavior rather than an inescapable fact. Ultimate truth is that you are never meant to be anything other than what you are. The rebellion isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been beneath all the noise, all the conditioning, all the lies you've been told about your own nature. You are already untouchable. You always have been. The only thing left to do is stop pretending otherwise.